please type into the chat pod or send me an email. It's best to send me an email during this while the webinar is going on. You'll find me faster than by phone. So at this point, I will hand it back over to Charisse, and thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And everyone who is participating in this webinar is also eligible to receive a certificate of attendance for the 1-hour webinar. And so after you've completed this webinar, please email us at calpro@aar.org if you're interested in receiving a certificate for your attendance in this webinar, and we'll be happy to get that to you. And I am going to introduce our wonderful facilitator this afternoon, Ms. Brigitte Marshall, who is now a consultant and is a former director at Oakland Adult and Career Education. At Oakland, Brigitte helped that program to grow in amazing ways by creating opportunities for students across a variety of needs in our different programs that we offer. Brigitte also most recently was the assistant superintendent of human resources for Oakland Unified School District, and she has taken the work that she's done in adult education. She was one of the forerunners on helping to develop the strategic plan in adult education for the state of California. She has taken that information and her experience in human resources, her experience as a director of an adult education program, and really put together an amazing presentation for us this afternoon on how we manage change in this time of critical change that is continuing to happen across the field in adult education. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brigitte. And Brigitte, please take it away.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Charisse. Good afternoon, everyone. I have to say that sharing this presentation with you today feels a little bit like coming home after a long, strange trip. It's nice to be back. Evidently, a great deal has changed in the world of California adult education while I've been off in the land of HR, talent development, and organizational effectiveness. And I'm really happy today to be able to bring together my former life as an adult education professional and my current life as an organizational effectiveness professional. And I have a specific focus on restorative practices when conflict has occurred. And that's not to say I'm assuming that you are experiencing conflict in your current contexts, but just to say that that's a particular focus of my organizational effectiveness work. I'd love to catch up with former colleagues. I saw lots of names I recognized on the list of participants. That was really exciting. And I'd also love to connect with adult educators who have joined the field since I left it. So you will see that there is contact information for me on this slide, and it's also on the resource handout that I've prepared for you that accompanies this presentation. So please don't be shy, follow up with me. I'd be glad to be in touch with anybody who's participating in this webinar. I want to just say a quick word about how I have designed the handouts that accompany this presentation. You really don't need handouts in order to get the most out of this webinar. Sit back, experience it, interact, think, talk with your colleagues. But what I've prepared for you as a resource to support this presentation is a more comprehensive version that captures pretty much everything I'm going to say today. So I think there are about 14 slides in this presentation. In the handout that accompanies it, I think there's at least twice that. I did leave out the graphics on the handouts to make it easier to download and print and copy. But I wanted you to have a coherent storyline that you can go back to and reference after you've experienced this presentation. There are several different places during the course of the webinar where I'll be asking explicitly for your input, but also please feel free to ask questions at any point, and I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on those little icons, and I'm sure Jennifer will be keeping me honest also and nudging me if I miss some questions. And so at any point as I'm presenting, please feel free. So, all that said, let's get going and start our conversation about how to manage change effectively. Ta-da! What comes up for you when you hear this word? Could I just get a couple of folks to rattle off some immediate reactions? Change. Chaos. Yikes. Opportunity. Busy times ahead. Implementation dip. Not again. Exciting. Excitement, new stuff. Opportunity for learning. It's unsettling. Yes. Oh, can't wait. So clearly some of us find change invigorating and energizing, an opportunity to improve things. Some changes are good, some changes are bad. We need to prepare. There are many, many different reactions and very many different ways of responding to change. If we can go back to the slide, Jennifer, I can show my next question. This is the one bit I don't have control over, folks. There we go. My next question for you is, what is the difference between a change and a transition? I wonder what your thoughts are on that. What is the difference between a change and a transition? The amount of planning, suggests Joyce. Beth isn't sure. Transition implies there's a known end in mind. Change could be immediate. Change is perhaps more planned, incremental. Support, moving from one place to another. Thumbs up for Kim's answer. Directive versus concept or field discussion. So several people feeling like transition suggests there's an end result already planned out. Change is the sustainable goal and transition is the process. One is having the tools, the other is how. Some very similar ideas and also some different ones. Transition is a gradual shift. Change is an idea, transition is a mindset. So here we have some interesting differences in some interpretations. Well, let me share with you how I approach those questions. Those were some great observations and reflections. I've learned to think about change in the following way, and more importantly, to think about change as compared to transition. I think about change as something concrete. It's something that happens to us. It's an identifiable decision or event that alters our condition in some way and to which we must respond. I generally say that often it's something that can be planned for and organized, though of course change can also sometimes be unexpected. And there's no judgment here, and it's neither good nor bad, it's just, as I've said. When it comes to change management, I think in terms of developing a large-scale outline of stages of the change, with dates for components of the change, perhaps deliverables identified that must be produced on a specific timeline, and maybe events that need to have occurred by a certain point in readiness for the change. Change management typically addresses change on a collective level. It works to organize the impact and outcomes of the change. So I'm using the term change, and then I'm thinking and talking about change management, because our focus today, of course, is on managing change effectively. So change works to organize the impact and outcomes of the change. It focuses on the end result. And typically, change management includes a lot of backwards mapping. It starts with the outcome and then works backwards to ensure that all the things that need to be in place in order for the change to be achieved by the target date occur in sequence. We sometimes refer to this as identifying and creating the necessary preconditions for change. And change management often involves project management, timelines, lists of deliverables, spreadsheets, process maps, flowcharts, and other tools. If we roll with this as our definition of change and our understanding of change management, let's think about some of the changes that you are currently managing in the arena of adult education. And I'd invite you to think about this either in the grand scheme of things on a state or national level, or in your particular school or community or classroom. If we could take just a minute to post some ideas, what are some of the changes that you are confronting right now? Periods of participation. Can you say a little bit more about that, Alison? Increased accountability. So adult educators are having to be more accountable for the outcomes and the results that their students achieved. Non-credit merging into credit. New WIOA alignment. Curriculum aligning with new ELP standards. So we've got really great examples of high-level changes and smaller degree changes. So aligning with community colleges, diversifying funding sources, collaboration in consortia, applying for competitive grants, looking for ways to grow, staffing changes, retirements, yep, that can be individual, needing a new crop of administrators, hiring teachers always, right? Staffing changes and turnover, implementation of career tech ed classes, students not I got it, okay, students not attending for more than 90 days so that you can count them, right, as participants when you're documenting your outcomes. Yeah, what about most of these are fairly big, high-level changes. What about some smaller changes that happen perhaps at a classroom level? New textbooks, digital program implementation in a department, right? So meeting consortium needs at the same time as district mandates. Ooh, collecting social security numbers, integrating technology, new data systems, Chromebooks purchased to bring technology to offsites. Right, so you've got to deploy the Chromebooks, you've got to allocate them, keep inventories, etc. Forming professional learning communities as a model for professional development. Shifts in teaching expectations. Is that expectations of teachers or the way teaching is delivered? Brian's going to give us a bit more information about that one. Oh, instructors not on board with change. So having to work with individuals who are not feeling it. Trusting that the Wi-Fi will work after we buy the Chromebooks. Yep. Implementing technology. Yes, we get too reliant on it. And again, staffing comes up, finding new teachers, constantly looking, training, launching new teachers. Yeah, absolutely. Hiring freezes when you need new teachers, expectations of how we want teachers to teach and deliver information. Got it. So the shift of mindset from completers to job placements. Yeah, so we're back to a big one there. So clearly there are some very significant and major shifts. And one of the things that many of you have called out is the manner in which change becomes personal when you are working with individuals on whom you need to rely in order for the change to be effective. So I'd like to share with you my frame for looking at change and the area where we need to spend the most attention and where we need to do the most work. I actually think that we need to talk more about transitions than change. Transitions are psychological. I want to say a bit more about that. We said that change is concrete and that change management addresses change on a collective level, right? And that it's oriented to the outcome. By contrast, transitions are personal. They're psychological and they represent what it takes for people to internalize and come to terms with the details and realities of a new situation. Getting people through the transition is essential if the change is actually going to work as planned. When a change happens in the absence of support for people to actually make the transition, it often just amounts to a rearrangement of the chairs on the deck. I'm thinking back to one of the comments that somebody shared, their perspective of the difference between change and transition. I think the word mindset was used a couple of times. I'm aligned with that perspective. Transition is much more personal. When we just rearrange the chairs on the deck, sentiments are represented like the more things change, the more they stay the same. And just because things have changed, don't think that anything is different around here. I'm sure we can all think of an example in either our professional or personal lives when a change happened, but people continued to behave in exactly the same way as prior to the change. And the change therefore failed to take root and achieve its intended outcomes. And that's why the distinction is so critically important, because you can flip the switch and say we've changed, but unless you've paid attention to the transitions and have worked people through it, that change actually won't stick. Yeah, Daniel's reminded us of what he said. He said, change is the idea, transition is the mindset. So in terms of transition management, we need to be thinking about plotting strategies to engage, involve, and respond to people who are in the mix of the change. Where change management is collective and focuses on the overall outcomes, I'd like us to think about transition management as being very personal. It addresses the change on a personal level, and it starts wherever people are and works forward from there, by contrast with what I said about change management, that backwards maps, right? It starts with the desired outcome and then travels backwards to identify all the things that need to happen in order to have that outcome occur on the desired date. Transition management is completely the opposite. It starts with where people are, wherever they are, whether they're happy, sad, excited, looking forward to the change. We saw the full range of different approaches and attitudes and feelings about change. Transition management starts with where people are and moves forward. It's oriented to the process. It's much less about outcomes, much more about the process. I like to think of transition management as the secret sauce that is needed to make change stick. And I'd suggest that it's when we don't take account of the need to plan for and support transition management that we are more likely to experience the head in the sand phenomenon. We don't take care of the way people are feeling about a change and how it impacts them. This is what we're likely to get. So just because transition management is personal and addresses to a great extent how people feel, it doesn't mean that it's all warm and fuzzy and unstructured. Transition management, I think, has very distinct phases that all need thoughtful and structured preparation and planning. I define the 4 phases of transition in this way. First comes defining. I sometimes call it naming and framing. Getting very clear about what the change is, why it needs to be made, what it is intended to achieve, how it will be approached, and so on. Then There's a phase of grieving. This might sound a little bit melodramatic, but it's when we fail to recognize what people are giving up and how they feel about it that we are most likely to unintentionally undermine the success and effectiveness of a change. After that, there's a period of what I call drifting. That's when the change isn't fully operational. Things likely aren't working smoothly yet according to the new. There can be confusion and the possibility of renewed resistance to the change. But it can also be a time of great creativity. And finally, the new beginning is when it all starts coming together and working in the new context. We're going to look at each of the phases in more detail. But before we do so, I think it would be useful to spend just a little bit of time thinking about why people resist change. So if I could ask for your input, share some ideas with us. Why do you think, or what has been your experience of why people resist change? So we've got fear showing up pretty consistently, fear of the unknown. And we've got this notion of being done to rather than participating. There's a level of discomfort. You can't be complacent. Yeah, comfort and fear are coming up. People who are used to the status quo, we know how it works. We're safe. Yeah, the fear of it creating additional work. And again, this notion of not being involved in the decision to change. When change is sprung on us, it rarely feels comfortable. It can be scary even when the present situation is bad. Yeah, it's bad, but at least I know how it works, what it's like. Again, this notion of having to work hard, uncertainty about what's coming. Routine means safety and comfort. Yeah, here comes another change. Here we go again. Yeah. And often there's this sense of, okay, we can outlast this. If we hang on long enough, this too shall pass, right? An exhaustion from it happening over and over, particularly without input. Yeah, confusion. Oh gosh, everything's going to go haywire again. Absolutely. And will it make any difference? Yes, yes, all of those resonate. As many of you have indicated, resistance generally comes from fear and anxiety about what is unknown. That's entirely natural and understandable, right? It's not actually terribly difficult to find reasons not to change. It wouldn't be logical for people to be excited and energized about something about which they know very little. I don't know anything about it or what it's going to be like, but I'm sure it's going to be really cool, is not a sentiment you hear very often. But I'd like to suggest that people actually don't resist change. As many of you have said, they're resisting making the transition from a known to an unknown. So I want us to shift the way we think about it a little bit. It's not so much the change that is being resisted, but the state of unknown as compared to the state of known. And then, as many of you have said, but I want to make it really explicit, resisting losses and endings, grieving for what was. There's a feeling of sadness and regret about what is being left behind often. And this can seem counterintuitive. I remember a situation in which school administration was deeply frustrated by a teacher who was resisting a decision to move out of a portable classroom that was damp. I think it had mice, and it was prone to power outages. I know that it had a leak in the roof. She was being moved into a newly refurbished classroom in the main building where she would be working in a pod with her grade level colleagues. Why wouldn't she be thrilled? As dysfunctional and inconvenient as her old classroom was, this teacher and her students had developed an affection for it and its idiosyncrasies. They even had a nickname for it. It was called Old Betsy, and a set of fun rituals they had developed whenever the power went out. They had also made up a class song inspired by the plink plink of the drips from the leaking roof. So if I don't remember to tell you the end of that story at some point as I'm going along in the presentation, somebody please remind me. But she was ultimately supported to make the transition. But for now, let's use what we know about resistance that comes from fear of the unknown and sadness for what is being lost to inform how we approach the 4 phases of transition. So let's look at those 4 phases now in a little bit more detail. So the first one, you'll remember, was defining. In order to address fear of the unknown, we need to provide as much definition as possible. Describe the heck out of it and keep doing it in lots of different ways. You may think you've said it, but as educators, we know that we need to say it again in a different way, write it, talk about it, discuss it, draw it, and say it again in order for it to be internalized. It's just the same in change and transition management. We need to be very specific and describe the change in as much detail as possible. What is the issue or problem? What is the situation that requires this change to improve it? Who says so and on what evidence? What would occur if this issue was not addressed? What would happen to us if that occurred? And then think through, what are the secondary changes that the change will cause? What are the further changes? Excuse me one second, my computer has just kicked me off. Oh, I'm back again. What are the further changes that the secondary changes would cause? And be cautious about making assumptions about what is obvious. An implication of a change that may seem obvious to you is not necessarily so to others. You need to spell out both the change and the sub-changes and the small implications that flow from them. It can be very helpful to develop what we sometimes refer to as the elevator pitch, or a tweet-length phrase that summarizes the impending change and the reason for it. Consistency and familiarity breeds security. So if you have people all across your organization talking about the change in the same way, using the same vocabulary and the same phrases to talk about the upcoming change, it helps to create a sense of the known, and it creates the impression that things are under control and being managed well when a consistent message is being delivered. So in doing that very simple strategy, you are directly addressing this notion of fear of the unknown. The more people are talking about it consistently in the same way, same language, same vocabulary, the more it becomes known or experienced as known rather than unknown. It can also be very helpful to develop what I call a theory of action. Some of you may be familiar with that concept. It might sound a bit stiff and formal, but it's actually a really good discipline for developing a consistent message. It could be as simple as something along the lines of, we believe that if we do the following, ... by ... then you describe the outcome. For example, we believe that if we, as a consortium, develop a collaborative, asset-based approach to adult education service provision, so that's the we believe if statement, by supporting each consortium member to focus only on the services where they have the best track record, rather than each consortium member seeking to provide the full array of adult education offerings, then we will collectively be able to provide the highest quality, most cost-effective services possible to our local adult education clients. And I just want to acknowledge that theory of action statements are often long run-on sentences, and it can help to present them visually on paper by breaking them down into those three segments. If we do, then by describing exactly what will be done, then this is the outcome we anticipate. It's a really excellent discipline for distilling and identifying exactly what the change is and what is anticipated as a result of the change. Let's move on to the second phase, departing. First and foremost, identify who is going to have to let go of something. Is there something that is over for everyone? How significant is the departure? And are you sure about your subjective assessment of significant? So if there is something significant that is going to change, is it significant according to your definition or other people's definitions? It might not seem significant to you, to someone else it might feel huge. And it's important to recognize that transition is not concrete. Attitudes, assumptions, expectations are the elements of the way things are and represent what makes us feel at home in our world. Because of the subjectivity of the way loss is experienced, it's important not to argue with what you hear from those who were impacted by the change. It's also important to be ready to hear it over and over and over again. Remember also that your end goal is not compliance or grudging acceptance, but rather commitment. And that commitment is generally only offered once people feel understood. So be careful to check any attitude of judgment regarding other people's overreactions. A reaction is an overreaction relative to our own or an ideal model. A perceived overreaction can come from a bad experience of loss in the past. This could mean that you're starting a transition process from a position of deficit. You've got a whole bunch of people who are anticipating the worst based on their prior experiences. It's also important to consider whether the ending feels symbolic to people. Is it being experienced as the beginning of the end, for example? A common mistake that people can make when handling what they perceive to be an overreaction is to try to talk people out of their reaction. You're actually not feeling what you're telling me you're feeling. It's not helpful, in case you didn't know that. What's important is to acknowledge the feelings of loss for what they are and bring them out into the open. Failing to acknowledge loss can be really counterproductive. It's much more productive to express concern for the people who are affected. And the thing that I always emphasize with people is be real. Show up for your folks and share the pain, even if that internal voice in your head is going, really? Really? You really want to make a big deal out of this? We have to go back to this slide or the slides in the handout and practice, run through the reminders when you're going to have a conversation, when you're going to engage with people who you know are experiencing a change as something of a loss, something that they need to give up. And it's really important to expect and accept the signs of grieving. And they might actually be quite difficult to recognize and name as grieving. They might show up as anger, sadness, fear, depression, confusion, denial, anxiety, disorientation, or any number of other emotions. But if you put yourself in the framework or the mindset of supporting and managing transition, it can be really helpful to just keep telling yourself that what you're actually experiencing from folks is grief. A very helpful practical strategy that you can look for is to compensate for the losses. Is there something that can be given back to compensate for what's been lost? For example, if a room assignment change means that a teacher has lost the quick and easy access she had from the car park to her classroom, Can she be provided with a wheelie cart to make it easier to transport her materials? And that, it sounds so obvious and so simple, but I cannot overemphasize that those kinds of gestures go an enormously long way in helping people to make that transition journey and get toward not just acceptance, but commitment. Let's see, there's one other thing I wanted to say about that. Oh, communication. Remember to keep the flow of information going. You cannot over communicate in situations of change. Provide frequent updates, define what's over and what isn't, mark the endings and treat the past with respect, and show how endings ensure the continuity of what really matters. Oh, and this is where I'm going to tell the end of the story about our teacher in the leaky portable. One of the school administrators brilliantly suggested that she and her students write like farewell poems to old Betsy, this old portable, celebrating the fun and learning that they had enjoyed there. They did that, and then they stuck them up all over the exterior of the portable, and they had a little farewell ceremony. And almost immediately after that, the administrator shared with me that this teacher, who had been extremely resistant about this room change, started engaging in a really productive way and really digging into the logistics of moving her belongings into the new classroom and setting it up with the consistency of it being as awesome of a learning environment as old Betsy had been. And I just want to point out that the administrator invested a small amount of her time and no financial resources whatsoever in supporting this teacher's grieving and letting go. And in so doing, she positioned the teacher to move on really productively. So now we've supported people to let go and turn their attention to the new, but it's not yet fully operational. Change is rarely experienced as a flip of the switch that marks a seamless and immediate end to the old way of doing things and the start of the new. What typically happens is that a period of what I like to call drifting occurs when new systems and strategies are emerging. And I think what we'll do is start thinking about this phase by doing a little visioning activity. I want you to imagine that you're on an ocean liner, but it's adrift. The engine is bust, spare parts are needed, and you're far out at sea. You will get to your destination eventually, but it remains to be seen how long that will take and what kind of emotional and physical shape passengers will be in when they arrive. So what I want you to ponder a little bit is what part you would play while the ocean liner is drifting. What contribution might you make to the situation? All right, so Kim is going to be a motivator and a cheerleader. We're heading in the right direction and we will get there eventually. She's going to keep people's morale up. Ah, we have an RN on board. She would run a clinic for people who need medical help. Okay, Beth is going to keep everyone calm. Maybe Beth can offer some meditation. Ah, Sylvia's very practical. She's going to make sure that radio messages are going out. Devon's looking to see what kind of support is needed. So we've got a sort of hierarchy. We're going to make sure that physical needs are met, help the crew cook and distribute food. Everybody's got to stay nourished. Teresa's going to be the PA system. She's going to help with communication. We've got some emotional comfort. Roll up my sleeves. Get on with it. Any necessary assignments. We can have fun while we wait. We can do crafts and be creative. Oh, we're looking for opportunities to engage differently with people. Oh, give people jobs, keep them busy. I'm not going to read all of these, but I'm pulling things out. So lots of emotional engagement there, some practical approaches, and then also looking for some opportunities to engage with people. Make sure passengers have games to play and keep their minds off of the situation. Yeah, you are an amazing group of people, and you have highlighted many of the things that I want to emphasize in this little section. So Andre Gide said that we're not going to get somewhere new unless we're prepared to let go and be adrift for a while. I'm going to pull all of these up, and I'm keeping an eye on my time. I'm going to move a little bit quickly now, so bear with me. Let me know if I'm speaking too fast. Drifting is exactly what it says. It means that we're nowhere between two somewheres. You know where you came from, and you might have a good idea of where you're going, but there's a lot of uncertainty, right, in what it's going to be like before you actually get there. So drifting requires a special kind of leadership, and you called out a lot of the things that are needed in your comments just now when we shared. Leaders need to remember that while drifting, anxiety can rise and productivity can fall because people feel untethered. The old way of doing things is no more, but the new way of doing things isn't yet functional. Sometimes in change situations, we often talk about phasing things in or piloting things. And we also talk about it being messy, right? And we have to be comfortable with the mess. Often in these kinds of situations, old weaknesses reemerge and rear their ugly heads. Things start to feel like they're falling to pieces. Your people can feel like they're getting mixed signals about priorities. It can feel like you're characterized by uncertainty and frustration. And this is often the moment when naysayers have their field day, right? They say, I knew this wasn't going to work. But I also want to point out that it's also an opportunity where creativity can really flourish. And how much of the negative aspect or the creativity comes out is really a function of the extent to which you're successful at normalizing and redefining drifting. So if you anticipate and describe what's going to happen before you're adrift, name the reorientation and redefinition that will need to take place, and you're explicit that fear and confusion are going to happen. We're not really going to know what's going on to a great extent for a while providing reassurance that we're going to get through it, then you can position people to be innovative and creative. And just as folks were calling out, well, if I was adrift on the ocean liner, I'd set up a clinic because that's a skill set that I have and the situation can call on. And I'd use my initiative to keep people's morale up by launching craft and art activities. And I want to point out that language is really super important. Be careful of the words that you choose. For example, the end of an era sounds final and regretful, whereas the end of a chapter implies that there's more good stuff to come. So just a reminder that words matter and really make a difference. It is super important, as many of you called out on our ocean liner adrift, to create temporary systems while you're drifting. This should involve the following: protecting people from further change. If you're launching a significant change initiative, please don't layer on additional unrelated changes. It's just too much for folks to expect them to handle all of that change well at one time. It's also often a good opportunity to review policies and procedures because they may not still be relevant, supportive, or adequate while you're drifting. It's also helpful to identify clear short-term goals to keep people motivated as things are getting worked out. People get so tired of that phrase, we're building the plane as we fly it. It's not comforting to most people. They don't actually like hearing that. So identifying clear short-term goals that people can achieve within a reasonable time frame does much more to keep people motivated and with a sense of someone around here knows what's going on than that reminding them we're building the plane as we fly it. I think it's also really important to recognize that your people may need just-in-time training to approach situations that have emerged unexpectedly. It's one thing to say, oh, yes, we're drifting, we're adrift, things are happening that we hadn't anticipated, but that doesn't mean that you can't craft immediate responses to them and support people in knowing how to handle them. And transition monitoring, I really want to emphasize how important this can be, particularly if the change is significant and far-reaching. I would recommend monitoring the transition intentionally by designating a group, perhaps 7 to 12 people, to keep their finger on the pulse of how things are going. And remember the difference between change management and transition management here. In change management, a monitoring group is often put together to ensure that the project plan and timeline are on track. That's very different from what I'm talking about. In transition management, the monitoring group is staying tuned to how people are doing with the change, emotionally, psychologically, personally, and to help lift up the support and encouragement that people might need. And then just to say a few more words about creativity. Really inviting and engaging people to generate creative solutions and create opportunities for organizational and individual stock taking. Sometimes when I've done this and similar trainings with other groups, people suggest that it might be a great opportunity to repaint the ocean liner or get people together to stitch cushion covers for the worn upholstery on the boat, all sorts of creative ideas that say, while we're adrift, why don't we take care of some operational things that would help in the long run? But most importantly, I want to emphasize the importance of trusting your people and demonstrating trust for your people. I firmly believe that if given protection, encouragement, structures, opportunities, engagement, resources when available, and perhaps most importantly, time, that the vast majority of people will emerge from the drifting phase energized and ready to rock and roll. But beyond actually trusting them, it's super important that you demonstrate your belief in their resilience and their ability to prevail. So now, ta-da, we're ready for the new beginning. However, I want to offer up a few cautions. Oops, sorry, got a little ahead of myself there. We're ready to launch the new beginning, or are we? Often this is where what I call waffling can happen. The beginnings can reactivate anxieties because they ratify the ending. For example, you often hear people saying, it's really happening, and then it might not work. And the feeling of risk can overtake them. Last time we launched something new, it was a terrible experience. And some people really feel a sense of loss when the drifting period comes to an end because they found themselves thriving in this era of less accountability and less structure and creativity. And they're sad to see it end and the recognition that more structure is on its way. And I want to say that a project plan for an organizational change will often identify a date when the change is supposed to be operational. But it's very difficult for people to change their behaviors because the calendar says they should. Typically, people change their behaviors when the timing of a supported transition process helps them to do so. You actually can't force a new beginning. And in my experience, it grinds to a halt if it's not preceded by well-managed endings and a period of drifting. So let's see, what did I want to say about that? Oh yeah, as you're getting close to the go live date, I want to remind folks to go back to the theory of action, to the elevator pitch, and explain the purpose again and again and again of the desired outcome. And it's critically important at this point to be real. And I always give a budget example here. If budget cuts mean that projects have to be changed or ended, or that positions have to be eliminated, say it, say that. Don't make it soft around the edges. Don't hide behind statements like improved effectiveness or operational streamlining. Say it like it is. And above all, again, communicate consistently. Same vocabulary, same phrases. Paint a picture. And I want to give you a biblical example. I love this example. I think it's very clear. You want to engage the imaginations of your people. So as you're launching the new beginning, getting evocative and making visionary statements is really important. And the example is Moses, who translated the idea of the promised land into the picture of a land of milk and honey. And I think that contrast is really, really clear and accessible. And I would really encourage people to make the change as visual as possible at this point. Pictures, plans, flowcharts, comparison tables before and after, models, mock-ups, whatever you can think of to make it tangible and visual to people. And then planning, and communicating that plan is absolutely critical. And then, of course, giving everyone a part to play. Cannot emphasize too strongly how critically important that is. And this can be done in a number of different ways. There are formal structures like planning task forces. I mentioned the transition monitoring team. You can have problem-solving circles. You can have think, pair, share activities at the beginning of staff meetings. You can do a climate survey group, so many different formal structures. And I just want to list off some of the really key reasons why it's important to give everyone a role. Those of us who have been charged with making challenging decisions know that those decisions are always better and of a higher quality when they've received input. So when you involve people, you get new insights into the real problems being faced by the organization, and particularly the people who are going to be impacted by the change. A second really critical thing to emphasize is that when problems are shared, leaders and team members can be aligned on one side, and the opponent to be tackled is the problem, rather than leaders who are initiating the change pitched against individuals who are resisting or grieving for what was. And as I previously said, including people means that their knowledge, their experience, their suggestions are made accessible to decision makers. It's really important that unforeseen or unanticipated impacts of a change are surfaced and brought out into the open. If they're not, then they fester and breed resentment. So involving and including people, though it often makes the transition and implementation stage longer, is worth the time, effort, and resource investment because it positions the change for more effective and more long-lasting results. And perhaps the most important aspect is that everyone who plays a part is implicated in the outcome. It's more important that people support the solution than that it is the ideal solution. Let me say that again, I garbled it a bit. It's more important than people, I did it again. It is more important that people support the solution than that it is the ideal solution. Much better to have a second grade solution that everybody supports than to have the perfect solution that few people support. A successful change, is about 7 parts commitment to 3 parts strategy. And getting people to be committed is all about treating them well as they are going through the different stages of a change. And I'm going to conclude with one of my favorite quotations from a British historian, of course, because I am, Henry Thomas Buckle. He said, "Every new truth which has ever been propounded has, for a time, caused mischief. It has produced discomfort and oftentimes unhappiness, sometimes disturbing social and religious arrangements, and sometimes merely by the disruption of old and cherished associations of thoughts. And if the truth is very great, as well as very new, the harm is serious." Change is not easy, folks. Managing it is not easy, but managing the transitions that people and individuals go through in the course of being engaged in change, I truly believe is the secret sauce. And I hope that what I've shared with you today and the resource that has been made available to you in the form of the extended slide handouts will provide you with some ideas to approach the changes that you're confronting in your own adult education communities. And I know that we are at time at 3 o'clock, but I'd be happy to field a few questions or comments either now, or feel free to reach out to me offline also.
So thank you very much, Brigitte, and thank you all for joining us today. We have a couple of resources that you can download for the presentation. One of them is a PDF of the slides that Brigitte's presentation today. And then the other is the Reasons Not to Change handout, and that was the 50 reasons not to change, a little visual from earlier in the presentation. In order to download those, you can click on the resource that you would like to have, and then click on the download file button that will appear at the bottom of the screen. There will also be a webinar evaluation that will pop up at when I close out the meeting. But if you need to leave now, you can click on the webinar evaluation link, and then that will hit enter, and it'll browse right to it. And I also want to mention one more time that if you require a certificate of attendance for this webinar, if you could email me at jaldridge@air.org, and I'll put that in the question chat. And I want to say thank you all very much for joining us today, and thank you to Brigitte for this wonderful presentation. And I'm going to give a little applause if we remember how to do that. It's the little person icon at the top and the drop down, and say thank you all very much for joining us today. I will be closing out this meeting in 1 minute, and then the meeting will be available on our website and I will give the link to that one as well. It'll be available on the website at the end of the week. There will be a link to the recording. So if there is information that you you want to review again, and you will also be able to download the files directly from the recording. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I will now be closing out the meeting.